requirements to have a manual, not procedures manual, but a manual on such as the engine manufacturer's manual on how to repair their engines?
No, it does not.
Right, but I believe you said it does have, recommend some procedure manual.
Yeah, it general procedures. It just lays out a general requirement, says that it'll require the owner to have a maintenance manual, an operational manual, and a training manual, and it shall include all the important things. It's a very generic statement.
And what about the qualifications of the people doing the work?
The Coast Guard does not require mechanics to be certified on any type of marine vessels, let alone ducks, which would be very unique, and there are no duck mechanic schools for that matter. So most of these mechanics have automobile repairing background and then hands-on OJT, on-the-job training from other mechanics. The Coast Guard does not require for maritime, other than licensed officers and licensed engineers and QMEDs, which are qualified members of the deck department who are assistant to engineers. Other than that, the Coast Guard does not require that repairers and mechanics have any special qualifications when ships are repaired in a yard, in a shipyard.
When they're repaired in a shipyard, is there not procedures by the shipyard, or is that as loose as this?
No, the shipyard has procedures. For certain things I'm aware of, for welding, of course, they have to be qualified welders. For this type of application, they meet OSHA regulations. As far as Coast Guard regulations, no. For repairs, no. Coast Guard does not get into that part.
Okay, I'm curious, since we are in this area of the report. In Duck 1, we clearly have the involvement of maintenance personnel in that misadventure. In the minnow, we clearly have maintenance involvement in that. And in this report, we clearly have maintenance involved in it. However, and we name it in the probable cause as well, maintenance. In fact, it's been started out as the #1 issue we started to address here today. And there's multiple deficiencies of the maintenance of the Majestic. Then, having read all that and recognized all that, and it's in the first line of the probable cause about adequate repair and maintenance to the duck that sunk. Other than what's invisible in the Coast Guard piece that we reference in recommendation 2, we don't have any recommendations whatsoever about the maintenance of ducks in this. Can somebody explain to me why we don't?
I think that we are of the opinion that the maintenance provisions of the Coast Guard's navigation and vessel inspection circular are adequate to help the duck operators to know what type of maintenance they should perform, and also provides guidance in record keeping and that sort of thing. Also, in the duck companies that we visited, especially Boston Ducks and Branson, we saw that they had very good maintenance programs. So, post Miss Majestic sinking, we don't know that there's an industry-wide maintenance problem. We know that there was a serious maintenance problem with Land and Lake Tours. But since Land and Lake Tours is no longer in business, we felt that there was nothing to be gained by making a maintenance recommendation to them. And we don't know of another duck operating company that has poor maintenance procedures.
But yet we have the two subsequent vessels that we participated in, both had maintenance involvement.
Yeah, the Duck 1, for instance, had maintenance procedures, and also the other one had a servicing manual. The issue in Duck 1 was more of company oversight, of human error, and the mechanic just forgot to put the plug back. For this sort of human error, that's why we went back to the reserve buoyancy issue, that a real fail-safe answer to this kind of seemingly simple error would be the fail-safe option, which would be the reserve buoyancy. On the minnow, the issue that I really came across to me was that the lack of understanding of that novel type of vehicle. It is a very complex mechanical vehicle, not much more so than a duck. It has lots of seals and bearings and oil levels to be checked. And I think the owner, he had owned that single minnow for the first time for the last 4 months, and just wasn't aware of it, which is why the need for a NAVIC to raise the awareness, that would be step one, to heighten the awareness of what it takes to operate one of these would be very helpful.
Ash, you make my point in that case, the second one you stated, that we should be making recommendations to deal with operating procedures. I mean, we do it here routinely in other modes, in railroads and aviation. Routinely, that is brought forward. Things to mitigate the human failures are brought forward. And yet, the one thing that jumps out at me is we have 3 accidents with human failings, with a process that's immature, and we don't even make a recommendation to the Coast Guard to mandate what they have in their NAVIC, nor do we address the deficiencies in that. I find that very troubling. No further questions.
Member Golia, if I might respond to that. We, in fact, do make the second recommendation is to ask the Coast Guard to require quite a bit of what is in their NAVIC. And we state those, and I'm afraid we have not finished making our presentations yet. That is something that we could certainly put up for you. But the recommendation that number 2 that staff has proposed details many of the items within the NAVIC and has asked the Coast Guard to require those of all amphibian vehicle operators. What I might also add, and it's actually just stating again what Ash has said, what we found with these vehicles is that they are extremely maintenance intensive. They have a very high requirement to pay detailed attention as to how they are maintained, how they are operated. They are 40, 50, however many years old, and they are deteriorating with time. And we're extremely concerned about that, which is why staff again reverted back to how can we make these essentially fail-safe, and that was with the required adequate reserve buoyancy. And once again, we looked at the proposal that had been made for making that retrofit, and felt that that was reasonable. I don't believe that the conditions of these vessels is going to improve with time. I believe it will, in fact, potentially deteriorate, and we will have another Miss Majestic accident. So recommendation 2, I think, is to address the issue that you have stated. But I would also add,
it doesn't, excuse me, it doesn't say that. It says require the following. It doesn't say require the NAVIC. It says require the following, and it has 7 steps in it, none of which address what I've said. That's the reason why I raised it.
Member Goldia, the 7th step does not fulfill your objection there, because that is what it was intended to do.
Okay, I'm sorry. It doesn't. In 7. But it doesn't, the NAVIC, as you just explained to me, only deals with half of the maintenance problems. There was 4 elements that I asked questions on. records, qualifications, manuals, and procedures. And I got no on qualifications and no on manuals. Procedures manual, yes. Operating manual, no. All right, so it falls short of what we routinely see here as part of the whole problem, or whole process to mitigate human failures. I'm very concerned after reading the report over the lack of qualifications for the people doing the work. Now, I've seen that in other marine areas as well. It's more difficult on ocean-going vessels to control that, but on these type of vessels where we can control it, it is all within our jurisdiction. It would be much easier to at least have some minimum standards for the people supervising the work. The question I asked Ash about the shipyards and the process, they have it. Even though there's no qualifications for the people doing the work, there's somebody watching the store. The person overseeing it should have some qualification, should understand what's needed, and not just let it go willy-nilly as this operator has.
If I might, I think that there's a number of folk who share that frustration, Mr. Goley. But the issue that you're raising actually is broader than the ducks and would approach at least all subchapter T vessels, and the requirements on maintenance training or qualification here do not differ from a broad class of vessels. And so the proposition that you're dealing with here has ramifications far beyond this accident. What was intended here was to look to the Coast Guard's own advice about the necessary additions to subchapter T recommendations for these vessels, recommendations the Coast Guard was looking at themselves because they understood the unique difficulties with these vessels, and to ask that the Coast Guard not issue these as guidelines, but to make mandatory all of the improvements that they had suggested would be necessary to bring these vessels at least into a state of equivalency with other subchapter T vessels. We have not gone beyond that and reviewed the qualification issues for subchapter T in general.
And what about the record keeping area? I mean, and it was just stated that the records were not kept. There's no recommendation in the NAVIC to keep the records.
Mr. Member Golia, I'm reading from, there are things said about maintenance logs and procedures in the NAVIC. Let me read the paragraph, a brief paragraph on page 38. It says in the NAVIC that each owner-operator should be strongly encouraged to develop a company operations manual incorporating training standards, maintenance standards, operational standards, and emergency response plans. And then later on it expands, and on the maintenance standard should list all systems to be checked and their maintenance cycles. The maintenance performed should be properly documented in logs or check sheets and signed by the mechanic. It should describe a deficiency correction procedure and interaction with the operators of the duct, and so on. And there's one on training standards should state the company requirements that must be met to be a duct mechanic, driver, master, and crew. The standards should cover pre-employment, post-employment, should educate the employees on methods to identify potential safety problems, and so on. So it's on page 38 that it goes into that nature of requirements or strong recommendations.
38 of our report?
No, I'm sorry, of the NAVIC, Navigation Vessel Inspection Circular. I can give you a copy right after this meeting.
It probably would have been helpful if we had one before the meeting.
I have it, John.
I
I believe it's in our book. Perhaps it's not in yours. Let's.
Okay, thank you. No further questions.
Member Black. All right. At this point, I think it would be helpful to go ahead and have the presentation on the survivability issues. We may want to return to several of these before we complete the discussions, but I'd personally like to see the presentation rounded out at this point if we could.
Good morning, Chairman Blakey, Vice Chairman Carmody, members of the Safety Board. The survivability safety issues found in the Ms. Majestic report and to be discussed in my presentation are the adequacy of passenger space arrangements, The influence of canopies on emergency egress, required standards for amphibious passenger vehicles with canopies and without reserve buoyancy, and wearing life jackets on amphibious passenger vehicles. The Miss Majestic, like similar amphibious vehicles, was originally designed for landing military cargoes during wartime and not for commercial passenger service. When the seats were retrofitted, the seating arrangement did not comply with Coast Guard regulations under which the vehicle was certificated. The Coast Guard required 30 inches for the width of aisles. The Miss Majestic had 12. The Coast Guard required 30 inches for the spacing between seats, and the Miss Majestic had 26. Coast Guard officials stated that they must have granted the Miss Majestic a waiver for these dimensions of these spaces, although the agency had no documentation on the waiver. Further, the agency officials could provide no rationale for how the dimensions were determined. Although the survivors did not state that the reduced aisle width or spacing between seats hindered their escape, the reduced spacing would have made seating cramped and have restricted their movements. In the circumstances of this accident, however, the impact of these features on the egress of the passengers who did not survive cannot be definitively determined. Following the Miss Majestic accident, the Coast Guard issued NVIC 1-01, which provided new dimensions for fixed seating arrangements on ducts based on limited design and construction and relatively short in-water operations. However, the Coast Guard provided no basis for the waiver to show that the minimum criteria will not impede emergency egress. Be that as it may, in staff's opinion, the major consideration in assessing the ability of passengers to escape from a sinking duct is the overhead canopy. All but one of the survivors stated that the canopy was an impediment to their escape. In the case of the Miss Majestic accident, the force of the water rushing over the stern was strong enough to sweep a 6-foot, 6-inch, 200-pound man standing near the sixth row of seats forward and pin him against the windshield. As the Miss Majestic sank, the metal framework on both sides of the passengers and the continuous canopy over their heads essentially caged them, making escape in the limited available time extremely difficult. 7 of the 8 survivors managed to escape from the Miss Majestic as it sank to the bottom of Lake Hamilton. Most of the survivors could not remember how they escaped, only that they were lucky to escape entrapment by the canopy. 7 deceased passengers were not able to exit the vehicle. The canopy of the Miss Majestic is a common feature in amphibious passenger vehicles. Staff notes that while the Coast Guard's NVIC recognizes canopies as an impediment to passenger egress, it does not address the safety implications of canopies over passenger seating or their negative impact on passenger survival in the event of sinking. While the NAVIC sets a minimum window frame vertical clearance and suggests that canopy support frames be aligned with seat backs, the Coast Guard provides no basis to show that these arrangements will not impede emergency egress. Amphibious passenger vehicles in service in this country carry more than 1 million passengers each year, including a great many children. The nature of this unique vehicle is particularly appealing to children and is often used by school groups. Children are particularly vulnerable when traveling as passengers on amphibious passenger vehicles, and even if an adult accompanies them, their survival can be jeopardized. Each of the 4 children under age 15 on the Miss Majestic was accompanied by at least 1 adult. Of these children, 3 did not survive, and the 4th survived by mere happenstance. Staff is particularly concerned that both adults and children wearing life jackets are at risk of being drowned if entrapped by the overhead canopy. A more realistic approach to ensure passenger safety would be to afford passengers a reasonable opportunity to escape by removing the canopy. Staff concludes that the canopy on the Miss Majestic was a major impediment to the survival of passengers and contributed to the high loss of life. Moreover, on amphibious passenger vehicles that cannot remain afloat when flooded, canopies represent an unacceptable risk to passenger safety. Some of the owners of existing amphibious passenger vehicles have stated that the installation of adequate reserve buoyancy through passive means to existing vehicles is not practicable. This points to the challenge owners have in operating amphibious vehicles originally designed for wartime application for commercial passenger service. The slides you see show the contrast between the two applications for ducks, Larks, and Albus Stallworth, and we had previously discussed these slides and the contrasting applications of wartime use and passenger service. In staff's opinion, if providing existing amphibious passenger vehicles with sufficient reserve buoyancy through passive means to remain afloat and upright in the event of flooding is not practical, then alternative action that prevents passengers from being trapped inside the vehicle in the event of sinking should be taken. Consequently, staff believes that until such time as amphibious passenger vehicle owners establish sufficient reserve buoyancy to remain upright and afloat in a fully loaded condition, the Coast Guard and governors of New York and Wisconsin should require the following. 1, removal of canopies for waterborne operations. 2, re-engineering of each amphibious vehicle to permanently close all unnecessary access plugs and to reduce all unnecessary through-hull penetrations to the minimum size necessary for operation. 3, installation of independently powered electric bilge pumps that are capable of dewatering the craft at the volume of the largest remaining penetration to supplement an operable Higgins pump or a dewatering pump of equivalent or greater capacity. 4, installation of 4 independently powered bilge alarms. 5, inspection of the vehicle in water after each time a through-hull penetration has been removed or uncovered. 6, verification of the vehicle's watertight condition before each waterborne departure. And 7, compliance with all remaining provisions of NVIC 1-01. In looking at the operation of ducks, staff recognized that removal of the canopy by itself is not adequate to ensure the survivability of passengers in the event of sinking. Even though passengers would not be trapped inside the vehicle when it sank because the canopy was removed, they could still drown after they entered the water. As shown in the Miss Majestic accident, ducks without adequate reserve buoyancy will sink rapidly once water begins to flood into the hull, leaving little or no time for passengers to retrieve and don life jackets or to assist children in donning life jackets. Therefore, staff believes on amphibious passenger vehicles without adequate reserve buoyancy where canopies have been removed, passengers should be required to don life jackets before beginning waterborne operations. That concludes my presentation, and staff is prepared to address questions from the board.
Thank you, and that's very helpful. And certainly as we look at the description in the report as well as the slides you provided, it's very clear what a tragedy the situation was with the Miss Majestic with the canopy windshield configurations. That should never have been allowed to happen. That said, as I looked at the NAVIC and as I tried to determine what the Coast Guard has now recommended, it's not clear to me whether they believe and we believe that there are canopy configurations which are not as detrimental to safety. They address the issue of opening size in terms of the windows, the attachments of the canopy, but what has been our experience in our discussions with the industry about whether there are safer ways to actually shield passengers from sun and the elements in using these vehicles? You can see from an operator standpoint, apparently they all use them currently. Is that correct?
By and large, that's true, yes.
What has been the discussion about, as I say, a safer type of canopy? Has there been one?
There have been general discussions among staff, and we have had input from industry about limiting the size of the canopy, raising the openings. Industry has tried to provide innovative ways to make sections of the drop-down screens on the side fall off with simple procedures that would increase the vertical width of the opening. The suggestion the Coast Guard has provided about aligning the framework for the canopies on the side, align them with the seat backs would help. The Coast Guard's minimum requirement for a 32-inch clear vertical width would help. I mean, these are all suggestions moving in the right direction, but staff's concern was that given how fast these vehicles will sink and the time it takes to get a passenger into a life jacket adjusted and prepared to exit the vehicle, the size of the vertical dimensions and widths of the opening along the side make it moot because there's not enough time to get out of the vehicle in the first place. With the canopy in place, the size of the opening almost becomes irrelevant. So staff's conclusion was that the only way to ensure in all situations the safety of passengers would be to remove the canopy altogether.
I note the recommendation says removal of canopies for waterborne operations. Now, what I would conjecture, therefore, is that you believe that there would be circumstances on land when the canopies could be used. Is there such a thing as an adaptable canopy out there in use for this size vehicle so that it could be used when they are on land and not on the water?
It's probably technically doable to make a canopy that could be taken off for waterborne operations and put back on. There's no specific requirement for a canopy for land use. We checked through the Office of Highway Safety, and they found no requirement that the canopy be there, and they found no requirement that if it were removed, we'd be violating a highway standard.
Well, considering the number of convertibles out there, I'm sure that's correct. So
that's true, and technologically, there are. I mean, we brainstormed among staff. You could have retractable canopies. There are innovative ways to comply with the regulation that would be other than totally removing it.
all right, that's helpful. Vice Chairman Carmody. Member Hammerschmidt.
Thank you. Well, looking at that proposed recommendation where the first element is proposed to be removal of canopies for waterborne operations, and then looking down at the next couple, such as the next one, which says re-engineering of each amphibious vehicle, et cetera, would it be a more circumspect approach to take rather than just coming out and saying removal of canopies without having done the engineering analysis that I doubt that we've done on that? Would it be more prudent to recommend to the Coast Guard to, rather than removal of canopies, to re-engineer, require the following: re-engineering of canopies or canopy systems that will not hinder the safe egress of passengers in a waterborne emergency? In other words, recommend that they come up with a solution rather than this just rather simple approach of just removing them. Because in studying this issue, there are a whole variety of canopies. Obviously, the one on the Miss Majestic and the one on the last slide that you showed very clearly have an entrapment effect. They are, loosely speaking, cages if you're trying to escape from a sinking duck. And yet there are other, I'm sure, solutions to that problem of getting out of the duck in a sinking situation, which would not mean that you would not have to remove the canopy if it were designed in a way that would give you lots of clearance. So is that something that we've done the technical analysis on to understand better, or should we suggest to the Coast Guard that they just ensure that any canopy system will not hinder any safe egress in an emergency situation?
We looked at the various options in wording that recommendation, and kept coming around to the same conclusion that if you made it subjective, and your word hinder is a good case in point, how do you determine what hinders somebody and what doesn't? I mean, to what standard would the Coast Guard have to set a canopy standard and define the word hindered? We felt that it was absolutely crystal clear our intentions if we specified, remove them for waterborne operations, that under any condition, that vessel sinking, the passengers will not be entrapped in either the fully deployed canopy or some partial canopy.
Right. I just know that prior to this meeting, I've been part of some brainstorming about how that problem can be solved in other ways in terms of canopies that roll back, or I think you described one or two briefly in your presentation, Mr. Henry, just other approaches to still provide the protection of the passengers from the sun and the elements, yet still not get in the way of a safe escape from an emergency situation. So, because a lot of those ideas have been floating around the past couple of days in various hallway discussions, I thought I would ask for the staff's views on any possible alternate language.
Excuse me, can I jump in while staff is chewing on that? With respect to Member Hammersmith's remark, it would seem to me that nothing would preclude the Coast Guard from responding to our recommendation with other alternatives if they so desire. I would personally prefer taking the cleaner, stronger view of saying remove them. If the Coast Guard finds it's unfeasible, impossible, if they have better ways, they could respond in that fashion. We wouldn't be in the position of negotiating with ourselves, which we kind of are here. That's my thought. Thank you.
Well, I think that's an excellent point, because the Coast Guard, we've worked with the Coast Guard for many years, and sometimes when you send them a recommendation that has a lot of components, they sometimes agree with a certain percentage of different ones, sometimes not with others, and then full agreement with others. And then we look at that as a whole and see if the objective has been met in a holistic way, I guess you could say, in terms of closing it out acceptable. So I think that's a very good point. But because we have spent some time discussing other options concerning the canopies, I thought I would just float that out for discussion.
Other comments on this? Member Black. Or Member Goley.
Just a question. In trying to understand and listening, I actually read some of the statements out of the docket from the survivors, which are pretty harrowing. I was especially interested in the large gentleman's comment about being thrown up against the windshield and trying to figure out how he got there. And this has something. I'm getting to the canopy in a moment. Actually, do we know how this thing sinks? Does it rotate about its center of flooded mass, or does it rotate about the front end? In other words, does it just drop tail down with the nose of the front end of the vehicle still above the water? Do we know that? I mean, that's a question about the canopy and whether there's anything that can be done about it.
In this instance, because it started flooding from the stern and it did that because it was initially trimmed by the stern. That's the normal floating attitude. So the water collected at the stern, and the stern sank deeper, and the bow went up. So that was the mode in which it sank, and continued to sink stern down, and it almost not vertical, but close to that. And when it landed at the bottom, it landed on its rear wheels first, rolled back, and that was the way it sank. But that's not always general. In the case of Duck 1, the plug was open at the bow, so it flooded at the engine compartment, and that went down by the bow.
Okay. Just wondering, because this is obviously you could see easily how someone could become entrapped, and from the statements and from the medical examiners or the divers, how they recovered the bodies, it sounds like this is a major issue. And certainly something has to be done. I'm sort of in the opinion that we need to let the Coast Guard, who is in that business, make their decision, tell them they have a problem, and let's see what they can do about it.
Other comments on this section?
So Bill Woody, I might just offer one comment. In talking to the Coast Guard during the time that the NAVIC was being put together, I raised the question with them about the canopy. They said that their general philosophy was that by providing bilge alarms and by dewatering pumps, that the operator would be given time to recognize the situation and to take charge, to instruct people to don life jackets. And that with the test they had done, they had come up with the idea that the canopy, if raised enough, could be, and the vertical stanchions were positioned as previously mentioned, that access from the vessel with people wearing life jackets was possible. And therefore, they felt that the canopy was something that could be in existence and could be worked around by that method of having advanced warning of a casualty. They also point out to me that there were other subchapter T vessels which had, in effect, a canopy or an overhead over the passenger compartments that the passengers had to exit. One of the things in the Miss Majestic accident, it wasn't clear in the beginning what the egress point was. This has clearly been established now that it's over the side. The openings over the side have been made larger. In the case of one of the operators we've talked to recently, he mentioned that the canopy itself is flatter. It didn't come down so far on the sides as the Miss Majestic canopy did. The clearances he had exceed those in the NAVIC. And when the side curtain is dropped, I believe he mentioned that the clearance was almost 40 inches out each side. So it would seem like that the predicating that we need to have the canopy removed is an assumption that the vessels are basically in an unsafe condition. There certainly are more risks to manage. There's boots that you have to put on right. But if these risks or these characteristics are accounted for by a competent company, the vessel can be relatively safe, and perhaps the need for removing the canopy would not be, in fact, established. I think that's my general viewpoint on it. Also, the need for wearing life jackets by passengers would therefore also not be required until there was an emergency.
All right, other comments on this?
One more question that has occurred to me. I noticed in the text that either the medical examiner or someone said that one of the passengers that did not survive was disabled.
That's correct. It was an adult woman sitting on the third row of seats. She had a companion, and neither survived. She had a mental disability.
I was wondering how they handle ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, or whether they are required to, because that raises a whole other issue. If this was not a physical handicap, then I suppose that's
correct.
At least not raised in this particular accident.
Returning to sort of the broader questions here, because I think we do need to move on to acting on the recommendations. And this has been a helpful discussion because this is obviously a challenging problem to address. I think there's no question about the fact that this investigation and the report well establishes the fact that this is a group of vessels and an industry that bears a greater burden, in effect, because of the use of an unorthodox vehicle with greater vulnerabilities. And I think that does certainly color my judgment about how far we should go, therefore, in recommending hard and fast requirements that they have to adhere to that do go beyond industry standards in a number of ways. That said, I'm also always cautioned by any time we are in a position of recommending retrofitting of vehicles that there is always the admonition to do no harm. And this is a form of vehicle that requires concern for both the land use and the water use of the vehicle. I was very struck in the NAVIC by the Coast Guard's comment that any alteration to the design of the duct must be carefully evaluated and monitored. Due to the interaction of the amphibious components of the vehicle, it is easy to solve one problem and unintentionally create another. I would candidly have hoped that in the 2 years since our safety recommendation has been on the street and industry has had an opportunity to work with us, that we have a better analysis at this point of what the obstacles may be or may not be to the most fundamental recommendation here, which does go to the issue of sufficient reserve buoyancy. I do not come away from this discussion right now with clarity about what the obstacles may be, whether they strictly are ones of lack of will, if you will, cost impediments, or whether they genuinely are operational and structural issues that, because, as Ash, you said, we have not gone into any kind of design engineering ourselves, we're making assumptions, of course, that may or may not prove to be true in a real-world environment. So I advance that issue to you because if we are voting for the recommendations as they stand, which do not allow any flexibility there, it would be my concern that as we move forward and look at the responses, we're also aware of alternative acceptable responses that could come in from both the Coast Guard and from the industry. Because unfortunately, even though it's been 2 years, we don't seem to have, as I say, the degree of clarity I'd like to see on what's possible and what isn't. There may be some staff thought about this before we move forward, but I did want to share that concern. Are there any other comments before we move forward here? Marjorie?
I'd like to say first, well put by the chairman.
Thank you. If we might have a few minutes to discuss your comments, I think that staff would like to do that. If you could give us a few? Or?
Certainly. No,
Okay.
we're happy
Thank you.
to. I think that we are at the stage of moving to the recommendations, and so it would probably be helpful for all of us to be able to just review for a moment anyway. So we'll take, may I suggest, I'd like to see if we can complete the report before we all break for lunch and move to the rail report. So if we could take perhaps a 5-minute break here, and then we'll move into the recommendations.
Thank you.
The staff is still conferring here, but in this perhaps faint goal on my part of wrapping the report before we all break for lunch, and we certainly will not if we need the time. But I wonder if we are at a point where we could return to you all on this, Marjorie, or do you feel you need more time?
Thank you, Chairman Blakey. I think the issue for staff is that they believe they have done all of the engineering calculations, that in fact for the engineering for ducts it's pretty straightforward, that the calculations are accurate. It is not a difficult calculation for a naval architect to determine if you can in fact retroactively make these vessels float even when flooded. However, we have taken into account your point, which is that you would be looking for something less than a requirement for the Coast Guard to create the incentive for the for the industry to do what we believe they are capable of doing. And
Marjorie, let me stop you because I don't want to leave an erroneous impression. I am not looking for having the Coast Guard create a less vigorous incentive necessarily. What I'm looking for is greater analysis on the fact that we've had 2 years since we put this recommendation out. And one of the benefits of the length of time it has taken to produce this report and to go through all of this presumably would have been the opportunity for our staff to have clarity about what the issues are with industry that mean that they have not done this. Because as I heard the description, it sounds like we have examples of one new vehicle, which is very encouraging to know that there is a new prototype out there, and that's being employed. We have then, in the case of 2 companies, one retrofit on one vehicle and one retrofit on another vehicle, possibly, is that correct? But considering the number of vessels we're talking about here, that would be a less than adequate response by anyone's standards. And we have heard from the industry, and I know that, as I say, Member Hammerschmidt has spent real time with them, and I'm still not getting to the question, okay, and therefore, what's the problem? That's what I'd like to know.
The calculations that the safety board had had conducted by JMS under contract looked at the feasibility that if you put bulkheads in those two locations and put foam, then would the boat stay afloat with the full load of passengers? And that's a matter of geometry, the available volume, and if the volume is there, and the weight of the water in the vessel balances with the buoyancy, then it's feasible. And those calculations are fairly straightforward. And those calculations indicate that for a duck, it is feasible that if you did put bulkheads in those two locations and foam, that the duck would float. Calculations of that concept level were not performed for other types of vehicles other than ducks. The question that industry has raised, as far as I understand, is that putting in the after bulkhead is not a problem, and has been done. The issue of foam has been worked out. There are foams that are removable and allows for inspection, easy visual inspection from inside the hull. So that hurdle has been crossed. Where I think the sticking point is in the detailed engineering of the forward bulkhead, because of the transmission, the powertrain has to pass through the bulkhead and has to have room for flexibility because the powertrain moves when the chassis racks and bends. And industry has told us that it's very difficult to do. It's very difficult to have to do that and run in the Lark. I was told that the air cooling from the engine compartment has to go through the bulkhead, and since there's no bulkhead, the cooling is very easy. But once you put in a bulkhead, it would be very hard to cool the machinery components. Now that kind of problem can be addressed by having ducting through the arrangement, through the bulkhead, and having watertight arrangements made, as are made on large ships. It is a question of how much detailed engineering they're capable of, and I have not really had plans submitted to me, nor have we asked for plan submittals for reviewing, which is not what we primarily do at the safety board. But those detailed engineering difficulties is where the sticking points have been, and those have not been addressed in our in the study that we did a couple of years ago.
Excuse me. I might mention just in passing that each time I have visited a duck operator, and I've heard a whole series of explanations about why this cannot be done because it would affect this, and if you affect that, it would affect this, and I couldn't begin to recapitulate those technical issues here today. But I have encouraged each operator in triplicate to write to the safety board and explain in great detail what problems that they are encountering in technical detail as to why they are not able to achieve the goal of achieving passive buoyancy or reserve buoyancy. And have we not received submissions from them detailing their concerns and difficulties? But I haven't seen them myself. But I've encouraged them now for over a span of many months, if not years, to do that.
I have seen calculations for a Lark LARC, on which we did not have an accident, which we did not investigate. But I have seen calculations on that, and that indicated to me that the internal volume that's available may not be adequate, and they would have to add sponsons or volume externally. But that was on a Lark. But I have not seen that for formal submittal to me for a duck or any of the others.
And you would have probably seen that, being the naval architect on this case.
I believe
right.
so.
Okay.
Member Hammerschmidt, I would just mention that we've only had 2 letters come in 2001, that all of the written correspondence was in 2000, and that was in spite of a follow-up effort on our part.
Well, the reason I was encouraging the operators on these visits to their facilities is because I was hoping they could educate us, obviously, so we would all understand better. the hurdles that seem to be there in terms of achieving this desired effect. So I just say that in passing.
Other comments or concerns before we move to the conclusions then? Unless, Marjorie, are there other points to be made here beyond, though, the issue we just discussed?
No, Chairman Blakey, other than I believe Ash in discussion mentioned that some of those revisions might mean that they would have to reduce the number of passengers that they would carry. For example, they could retrofit and they could put in foam, but that would mean they may have to, reduce the number of passengers by 2 or 4, and then you would have adequate reserve buoyancy for those passengers that remained on board. So I just thought I'd add that so you would realize that I believe that this staff has done an exceptional job in terms of the detailed engineering and review, and they have visited DUK owners and operators around the country, and in an effort to understand precisely what those technical issues are. So I would not want you to be left with the impression that we have been sitting here just waiting for a letter or something to come in, and although we have looked at every letter that has arrived. So I would just add that.
Well, I appreciate very much your pointing that out, Marjorie. I also want to say that I see this as a shared responsibility with industry. It certainly is not a singular responsibility with our board, so that we need to, in trying to move ahead on these kinds of things and find the right solution, it should be something in which we have the benefit of both sides on that, no question about it. Other comments on this? All right, well then I'd like, if I could, to turn to the conclusions on this and read the findings of the draft report. I will read each one of these, and if there is comment, emendation, etc., please stop me as I go through these. Otherwise, I will ask for a vote on these as approved at the end. The first finding of the report is that the water initially entered the Miss Majestic through the gap between the drive shaft and its housing because the securing clamp for the watertight rubber boot had not been adequately secured by the maintenance mechanic. Number 2, the Miss Majestic sank because the duck had no watertight bulkheads and no reserve buoyancy, and because its Higgins pump, which had been designed for significant dewatering capacity, did not operate. Number 3, the canopy on the Miss Majestic was a major impediment to the survival of the passengers. Number 4, Land and Lakes Tours Incorporated's long-time vessel maintenance was inadequate and directly compromised the safety of the Miss Majestic and its passengers. Number 5, the Coast Guard's inspection program for the Miss Majestic was inadequate and cursory. Number 6, the lack of Coast Guard guidance and training for the inspection of the ducks contributed to the inadequate inspections of the Miss Majestic. Number 7, industry and Coast Guard inspectors need to become more familiar with the general background and unique safety issues of all types of amphibious vehicles to improve the maintenance, inspection, and operation of specialized amphibious vehicles. Number 8, flooding from failed boots, open hull plugs, hull damage, collisions, groundings, mechanical failures, and other scenarios continue to present serious risk of rapid flooding and sinking in amphibious vehicles lacking reserve buoyancy. Number 9, on amphibious passenger vehicles that cannot remain afloat when flooded, canopies represent an unacceptable risk to passenger safety.
Let me ask a question on that one. I go back again to this transmittal memo on this report where, again, it states there was disagreement among staff regarding recommendation number 1 of the Coast Guard, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Then it says these same staff do not completely agree with the conclusion number, it's this conclusion we just read, and the recommendation to remove canopies. They have requested the conclusion state, and I believe I have the latest version of that they would thought that this would be more appropriate, and it would read canopies similar to that on the Miss Majestic that provide little vertical clearance for escape represent a grave risk to passenger safety. It's sort of a difference in wording, I guess you could say. The way that we just read it, canopies represent an unacceptable risk to passenger safety. I would say my view on it is that some canopies represent a more unacceptable risk than others, because there's a wide array of canopies. The one on the Miss Majestic is certainly in that was certainly in that category. So I open that up to staff again. I don't know if anyone wants to take my hand off on that, but is there any further thoughts about the revision that was referenced in the transmittal memo? Or does anyone have a further view on that? Which one would be the more appropriate? They state about the same thing. One is a little more, I think that the one that was not submitted as part of the draft report seems to be a little more specific.
Member Hammerschmidt, I believe that the revised conclusion that you read is basically the same thing that we said in conclusion number 3. So I don't see any need to say it again.
Okay. That's a good point. And in fact, even the one that's being proposed also is just a generalization of that other conclusion.
It's exactly that. It's applying the canopy issue to other vessels.
Right.
I mean, the Miss Majestic is out of service. It's no longer being used. So, but the issue of the impact of canopies to the escape of passengers still exists on other vessels, and that's why number 9 is necessary.
All right. Well, like I say, Mr. Woody, do you have any comments?
We certainly agree that the canopy on this Majestic was a grave impediment. But I think with conclusion 9, we're lumping all canopies together. And we do recognize that even in our slides today that they vary a lot. Some give generous clearance and others probably less. So I think that we cannot say that there's an unacceptable risk imposed by all canopies.
Well, if I might, as I understand, Mr. Hammerschmidt, your objection to number 9 is the categorical nature of it. And so if we could consider just after the word canopies, putting in the word can.
That our minds are thinking alike. I think that would solve that. And I wouldn't go as far as say that I had an objection with it. I was, again, because we had this transmittal memo that said there was a disagreement among staff on some of these issues. I just wanted to give everyone an opportunity to be heard. And so that was my main point, but I think that would improve that conclusion by putting that one word in. Thank you.
All right, so that would be your recommended edit on this. Canopies can represent.
Right.
If there's no further discussion on that point, I will go on to the last 3 findings, and then we will vote on those as a group with that emendation. Number 10, wearing life jackets before the vehicle enters the water would enhance the safety of passengers on board ducks without adequate reserve buoyancy where canopies have been removed. Number 11, weather, drug and alcohol use, and operator fatigue were not factors in the sinking of the Miss Majestic. And number 12, given the circumstances of this accident, the operator could not have taken any action to avert or mitigate its fatal outcome. Are there any other comments on the findings?
I have a couple I would like a little clarification on. On number 6, are we talking about the Coast Guard's guidance and training of their own people or to industry?
For their own people, because it's under in the inspection issue.
Okay, I just didn't see it that clearly there. And the only reason why I recognize it is the next one. Because we talk about industry and Coast Guard in the next one.
Yes, that applies to both.
Okay, and in number 8, I take it, this one we talk about in general terms, scenarios that can present serious risks. But in this accident and the 2 others that we sort of reference here, those are directly related to improperly performed maintenance. And what is staff's opinion to add improperly performed